Alright, welcome. So in this video we are going to explain the useState hook. And in order to explain this, we are going to build a very simple grocery list that you see here on the right. Now we don't focus on the CSS styling, instead we focus on the useState hook, so ignore this ugly looking UI that you see here on the right. So basically what we want is that when the user types in a grocery, here for instance milk, and then when the user clicks on the add button, then milk should become visible here on the screen, so we get some kind of grocery list. Now in order to make this work, we will apply the useState hook into our code. But before we start, let's first take a step back, because state is a key concept in React, but what is it and why do we need it? Well, in relation to React, state is an object that represents the parts of our app that can change. And each component can have its own state. Now this can still sound a bit vague, so let's explain this in more detail. So let's have a look at our current UI here. Now, if we want to make this UI interactive, so for instance when a user adds a grocery here, and then when we click on the add button, we want to make this change visible on the screen. In order to make this work, we of course need to keep track of this changing information, or in other words, when a user adds a grocery, then the state in this component changes, and the state change should become visible on the screen, because in that way we can make our UI interactive. So what does this mean in relation to the code? Well, this means the following. This is our current grocery list component, and it is a very simple component. Here we have the input field, and that is the field that we see here on the right. And on that input field we specified an onChange event, and this onChange event basically detects when the value inside this input element changes. So when a user types something here, then this onChange event handler detects the change, and we basically get that change and we execute the handle item change function. And inside that handle item change function, we set the grocery value based on what the user typed in. And then we try to add the value on the screen, and that is what we do here. So if we now open up developer tools and we go to the console, and let's remove this and this, and if we now type in here milk again, then we see that this is getting locked. However, we don't see it on the screen, even though we specified it here. Now, why is that? Well, this is because regular updates like this do not trigger a re-render of the component. So what we actually want is that when a user adds a grocery, what we then want is that this part of our code that we see here gets re-evaluated, because then we could get the new updated information or state visible on the screen. So of course, you know, this updates the grocery variable, but it doesn't trigger a re-render. So currently this whole part here is not re-evaluated, and that's why we don't see this change on the screen. Now useState hook to the rescue, because in order to fix this we can use the useState hook. Because with this useState hook we can update the state of a component, and what React then does is that it re-renders a component. So this basically means that every time the state changes, React will re-render the component. Now this can still sound a bit vague, so let's apply this useState hook and explain it along the way. Alright, so how do we use this useState hook? Well, in order to use this useState hook, you need to do three things. First, of course, you need to have a function component, because useState hook lets you add React state to function components. Now, luckily, of course, we have a function component, and that is our grocery list component. And the second thing we need to do is we need to import useState, or we need to import the useState hook from React. Like this, and then we can simply call this useState hook inside our component. So let's make this a bit larger, and let's call this useState hook like this. And important to note is that this useState hook must be called inside our functional component at the top level. So it cannot be called outside our component, for instance here. It must be called inside our function component at the top level, and we can also not call it inside any nested function. So important, we must use it at the top level of our function component. Alright, that being said, this useState hook expects an argument, and this argument is the initial state. So we can give this an initial value of an empty string, And then this useState returns an array with 2 items. Now the first item is a state variable that represents the current state, and the second item is a function that allows us to update the state. Now we can simply use array destructuring like this, so we can say const, and then we give the state variable the name grocery, and we give the state updating value the name set grocery. Like this. Now we can give this and this any name we like, but for the updating function the convention is that you place set in front of it and then you give it the name of the state variable. Alright, and remember this is equivalent to writing it like this. So yeah, here we get the first item in the array and here the second item, but here we use array destructuring, and yeah, in my opinion that looks way cleaner. So let's remove this. Alright, so to summarize very quickly, this is our state variable which gets the default value of an empty string, and this is our function that we can use to update this grocery state variable. So the only thing we need to do now is that we can remove this here, and then we also remove the log. And instead of this, we simply do set grocery, and then we give it the input value like this. Alright, so if we now go to the screen, or I mean to our UI, which we see here on the right, and we type in milk, then we see that this becomes visible on the screen. And that is of course because calling this set grocery function that we see here does not only update this grocery state variable, but it does a lot more. Because what happens behind the scenes is that when the set grocery function is called with a new value, then React will re-render our component and passing the new grocery value to it. And as a result, the state becomes visible on the screen. However, there's one important remark, because this is currently our default value that we specified here, but it is called every time our component re-renders. So let me show you what I mean with this. So let's create a function called const get default value, and that function doesn't take any parameters. And then inside the body of this function we simply print something like getting default value bruh, like this, and then we return an empty string like this. And then instead of using this empty string as a default value, we will simply call this get default value method like this. Alright, now let's open up developer tools. And let's clear this also. And if we now refresh the page, we see that this get default value brush printed. So yeah, this method here is executed, and that is of course because we specified a default value here. But what is important to mention is that when we type in here a grocery, for instance milk, we see that this function here gets executed every time that our component re-renders. Now here we do a very simple, we do something very simple, and then that is not a problem. However, if this was an expensive calculation, then this can become problematic. So situations like this we can fix with a term called lazy initialization. Difficult word for me. And what this basically means is that the initial value or the default value that initializes our state is only executed on the first render and not on every render. So in other words, we make it lazy. Now in order to get this working, we can use two possibilities. We can write this here like this, so we can simply remove the parentheses, and now this basically points to this method. So if we now open up developer tools again, we remove this and we refresh the page, then we see it is printed. But if we type in here milk again, we see that this doesn't get executed again and again and again on every change, on every state change. So yeah, we can write it like this, but there's also an equivalent, and that is that we pass in a lambda here. So then we simply write it like this. And this basically does the same, because if we now open up developer tools, when we refresh it, we see that it's get printed, and then when we type in here milk, we also see that this doesn't get printed anymore. So this function doesn't get executed again and again and again. So we see the same behavior. All right, so this is something to be aware of. For now, I simply use the default state like this because we don't do any strange things here. And then I will remove this. All right, so currently we only see the latest added item here. So if we type in here milk, we see milk. And if we change milk to eggs, we see eggs. Now let's extend our example by keeping track of all the added items and present them here below. So let's create another hook. useState. And instead of storing a single value, this state hook will store an array of values. So we give it a default of an empty array. And then in here, we give the state variable the name groceries. And the state updating function will get the name setGroceries. All right. And what we then want is that when the user clicks on this add button, then it should add the item that the user typed in here to this array that we see here. So therefore we will create a new function, which we give the name add grocery to array. And that function doesn't take any parameters. And what we then simply do is that we call the setGroceries update function. And inside that function, we set the new state. So what we can do is we can simply copy the elements of the existing groceries array. So therefore we can use this spread operator like this. And then we add our new grocery to it. So we simply type grocery like this. So we get this. All right, so and this function, we want to execute this function when the user clicks on this add button. So on the button, we specify an onClick event. So therefore we simply do onClick equals and then curly braces. And then we want to execute this add grocery to array method like this. All right, and then finally inside here we don't want to specify this here, but what we want is that we want to take this state here, groceries, and then we want to loop over all the items in the array like this. And then we want to make them visible inside a list item. So we can simply do this. All right. And if we now refresh the code and we type in here milk and we click add, it becomes visible. If we type in eggs, we see that it is also added here. And let's say water. All right. So this is exactly what we want. And this all works fine. However, there is an important remark to make, and that is that this state updating function that we see here, this setGrocery, that we get from the useState hook is asynchronous. So this means that state updates are scheduled for execution, but they are not immediately executed. So basically the state updates are enqueued and it is up to React to execute them. Now, because of this, you can get into these situations where the current state in your component isn't the most recent state because the most recent state update has not yet finished. Now, let's show you what I mean with this because I can imagine that this sounds a bit fake. So let's add the exact same update also here. Now, I know this is a strange example because why would you do that? But it is just to show you what I mean with what I just mentioned. So let's refresh the code. So what we would expect is that when I type in here milk and when I click add, that the grocery becomes visible on the screen 2 times. But when I click add, we only see it 1 time. And that is because what I just mentioned. So the state updates are scheduled for execution, but they are not immediately executed. Now this can lead to strange bugs if you are not aware of this. Now luckily there is another form of the state updating function, and in that form we can pass in a function and this function receives the previous state value and returns the new state value. So what we basically need to do is we need to change this to a function that takes the previous state as an argument and it returns a new state. So instead of using this groceries state variable, we use the previous state, and we do exactly the same here below. And if we now type in milk again, we click add, then we see that it is visible 2 times, just like we expected. So important to remember, if your state update depends on the previous state, then you should always use this alternative form of the state updating function. Because with that form, React will guarantee that the previous state here will always be the most recent updated state. Alright, I hope that makes sense. Now another important thing to mention is that you can have multiple useState hooks in your component like this. So this hook here works completely separately from this hook here, and of course also the other way around. So this means that when we update the state here via the set grocery update function, then this will not affect the state that we have here. Now lastly, we can still fine-tune our example a bit. So what we can do is that inside our input field we could specify that the value should be equal to the grocery that is typed in, and then once the user clicks on this add button, then it should remove what is typed in here because we have already added it to the list, and therefore we can simply do this. So we can go to the add grocery to array function, and then we can say set grocery back to the default value. Alright, now let's also remove this one because of course we want to update it only one time. And let's refresh the page, and if we type in here milk, we click add, we see that this is nicely cleared again. We can type in eggs. Alright, so this all works fine. Alright, now our grocery list component doesn't look very fancy, but of course that wasn't the goal of the video. The goal was to explain the React useState hook in a nutshell. Now, of course, you can do all kinds of fancy things. So you can remove items, stuff like that. So if you like to play with that, of course, you could do that on your own. So yeah, I hope you liked the video and I hope you learned something from it. And I see you guys in the next one.